start off, before we get to the juice of the talk, start off just with a little preamble, and that is about the reflection regarding how much we are influenced by the culture we grow up in. Even though we're all sitting here, I'm sure we pride ourselves in being freedom-loving individuals who decide for ourselves what we want to do with our life and what's important to us, and which to a certain extent we really do. But none of us can deny that the culture we grow up in or the culture we live in is a huge influence on us. And it's just like, it's like a smell that's around us. You've ever seen that scene in The Matrix where Morpheus speaks to Agent Smith, and Agent Smith says that the thing that he doesn't like about the Matrix is the smell, isn't it? He speaks to Morpheus, I think, and he says it's just the smell of the place is everywhere. You can't get it out of you. So similarly, the culture we live in, sometimes it can be a good smell, it can be a bad smell, but there's some smell. It's like this everywhere. You can't really avoid it. It just permeates everything, and it's sort of there in the background, forming the things that we think and our very deep beliefs and understanding of the world. It's all shaped by the culture that we live in. When we're younger, we're much more influenced by it, very strongly. But when you're a kid, it's crazy. Just if you think about back to high school, I always think sometimes how it would be if I could go back to high school knowing what I know now. I would definitely do things a little different. And one of the main things I think you would do is you would be more immune to certain ideas and like people and like the little gangs and the little cliques, and you'd be like, you'd not really be so influenced with what other people think, because you know that the world is much bigger than just this little school. But when you're a kid, your world is so small, and what do you really know? So you're so much influenced more by culture. But we don't escape that. So one of the main things that a culture gives us is a definition of success that is either very explicitly given to us or it's just built in all kinds of ways, built into our educational system. If you think about how our educational system works now, basically it's that the goal is sort of, if you're really good, you become a doctor, engineer, or lawyer, and that if you can't do that, then okay, if you sort of can't make it there, then you sort of maybe go do something else, and then you see, okay, and then every year we weed out the people, and we see, okay, every year you go to school, you have to pass. And then you sort of pass, and then you get to the final year in school, and then you see, okay, can you make it into college? And then you go through college, and you see, can you make it into grad school? And that's like sort of the general push that we have. It pushes in a certain way, and it's all informed by a certain idea of, what does it mean to be a successful person? And obviously, in the world that we live in now, a large part of that success is defined, mostly by money. And we see that in the ancient Vedic scriptures, they have this, in the 12th canto of the Bhagavatam. So the Bhagavatam is the Bhagavad Gita, we know. It's a sort of introduction, although it's not, say, introductory, it's actually very deep, but it forms the foundation for living a spiritual life in this world. And then there's the Bhagavatam, which is this huge book, thousands of verses, 18,000 verses. And in there, it's sort of like a continuation of the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, which is much more developed. But in the last part of the Bhagavatam, they have all these predictions for the age in which we are living in, for the modern world, in which direction the modern world is going. And they say it's interesting in the modern world that a person's value, like whether you're a good person, your moral worth, your character, it's basically just determined by how much money you have. And somehow, if you have a lot of money, then somehow you can also say a lot of stuff about the world. It's amazing. Like somehow if you make a lot of money, then you can just basically tell other people what to do, and you can be an expert, you can decide, you can become a coach, and you can just be a coach on whatever the heck you want on. If you have money, then people are like, well, this person must obviously know what they're talking about because they have money. And that's sort of, to a large part, that how the world works right now. But wealth is like really the main determiner of where you are positioned in society. And another aspect of the general myth, or let's say the mythos of success that we have, is that success is a result of, what could say, grit and like pushing yourself to the limit. Like we really value people who can push themselves to the limit. And in corporate America, for those of you who work in corporate America, you see that tendency is there in different industries more than others. I work in insurance, and what I love about insurance is that no one really cares so much about insurance. It's the best part of the industry because no one thought they would end up in insurance, and everybody has some story about how they sort of ended up in insurance. They didn't really wasn't planning it, and they're sort of there, and it's like, okay, well, we might go with this. Even the CEO of our company has a story how when he first applied to the company, they just said it's a finance job. And then when he turned up to the interview, they're like, oh, it's an insurance company. He's like, oh, if I knew it was an insurance company, I probably wouldn't have applied. But in any case, then he applied, and then somehow he later became the CEO. So that's what I love about insurance is that everyone's like, even my trainer in the beginning when I started doing the job training at the end, he probably said it like 10 times in the training. It's like, listen, at the end, it's just insurance. It's like, it doesn't really matter that much. So, but not all industries are like that. I'm sure if you work in AI now, those of you who work in it was like the cutting edge, and it becomes like this real thing, like who's going to really push themselves for success. And so different industries, they have their different culture that they also have. And we see in investment banking, wasn't it, even a few people here in New York, people in their 30s who die from heart attacks, from working, 120 hours a week. And so there's this kind of a status we put on people who can push themselves to the edge. And if you really want to be successful or grit, then especially if you start going on LinkedIn and you have all the people who push to become an entrepreneur, and the entrepreneurial coaches who are there to tell you that the only real life is you have to own your own business. And if you want to have your own business, the reason why you're not doing it, the reason why you don't have your own business, because you're afraid. You're just afraid. And you're not willing to push yourself to the limit. And therefore, you just cop out, and therefore you have a 9 to 5 because you're a coward. And you don't have what it takes to push yourself to the limit. And then you sit there, oh my God, is it really that bad? And so there's that element of where to be successful, you have to push yourself to the limit. And you can, in all kinds of things, in yoga also. And you see some people, they start doing yoga. Some people do yoga because it makes them feel good and you stretch. And other people, they do yoga to push themselves to the limit. And they like to push it and see they can do these intense poses and whatever, So there's that intensity that's there in our culture. And that intensity is in one sense encouraged and glorified and also cultivated to a certain extent. And I'm not knocking it. There's definitely a place for intensity. No great things have been done without intensity. And intensity is definitely, an intense push and an intense energy and definitely pushing ourselves to the edge. 100% has a place in life. It has a place in life. It has a place in spiritual life also. If you've ever been, we have this festival that we do every year at the Rasa Yatra, which we do this big parade down 5th Avenue. And we start up and we go down, we end in Washington Square Park. Been going on for since the 70s at some point. And it's an interesting story how they first got the parade, because in New York City, I think from the 50s, they basically said no more parades. No one can have a parade anymore. It's just too complicated, it costs too much money, and it obstructs the traffic. So they just made a blanket policy, no more parades. And then the people from the temple, they're like, we really want to do our parade, how are we going to do this? So they went, they spoke to them, they applied for a permit, they said, it's just to pull 3 hand-drawn carts. Just like wooden carts that are just pulled by hand, Like there's no machines, nothing, just some hand. They're like, okay, well, it's a hand-drawn cart, And then on the day of the parade, the carts are like 30 feet high. There's like these huge chariots that they bought. There's like 200 people who pull them. But in any case, we got the permit. So once you get the permit, then you're in. So when we do this festival every year, it is intense. My God, it's just like, Last year I was on trash duty, and I was like at 2 a.m. in the morning, still there in the park, like trying to squeeze trash into like a rented U-Haul. And so that stuff is also fun. Even in spiritual life, you want to do these big things, you need to have some intensity. So I'm definitely not against intensity. It definitely has its place. But like anything in life, it has to be balanced. There's another side as well. It cannot just be all push, intensity, because what happens then? That's why we also, even though we have this culture that glorifies intensity and pushing yourself to the limit, we also have a culture in which we are struggling with severe burnout and also addiction, which is all the consequences of too much intensity that's not tethered, that's not balanced out. There has to be something else in there to support that amount of energy, and you can't always be in intensity mode. So when I'm speaking about tonight, then is about this other element. So we could definitely do a whole lecture about intensity and how to like get hyped up and be intense, and how that has its role to play even in spiritual culture. You know, people can do all kinds of intense things, and if you live in a monastery, even like living in a monastery, for example, is intense. That's an intense thing to do with your life. I mean, who does that? Take 5 years or however many years, and you just go live in a monastery. It's like, so there's a lot of place for intensity, but tonight I want to speak about the other side, the counterbalance to that, which is something that we also have to have part of our life, because balance in life is always balance in motion, just like riding a bicycle. If you ride a bicycle, there's never a point where you can relax. It's like you have to always be balancing. It's by moving forward, you go a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left. It's like you have to the whole time keep your balance. And therefore we have to know what are these two opposing forces that we have to push at one another. So intensity and pushing is on the one hand, but then what is on the other hand? What is on the other hand? And on the other hand, there's another element, and that is where we get to the topic of restraint. So it's very interesting if we read ancient literature, and not necessarily just like Vedic literature. If you read, most ancient cultures have this great appreciation of the virtue of restraint. So if you look, for example, at self-restraint, it is glorified, or we'll get to the Vedic culture, it plays a very big part. But then if you look at the Stoics, for example, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, and so many of these moral philosophers, everybody has this understanding that a big part of being a cultured, character person is this ability to restrain, which is exactly the opposite of pushing. So pushing has to be there, but the ability to restrain has to also be there. And then we can use those two energies collectively. But you have to learn it. Just like you have to learn to be pushed above your limit, you also have to learn what does restraint look like? How do I practice that? How do I build that into my life? Because it is also very difficult. Very, very difficult. Especially for those people who are more intense. Because intensity gives a certain kind of taste that you can get hyped up. So you just drink a lot of coffee, you drink some Red Bull, and then you're good to go. But then that same person who has that go energy, to teach a person like that restraint and like measuring yourself and keeping yourself in check so that you cannot burn yourself out, it's very tough. It's also something that you have to learn. So pushing against the limits has its place, but knowing our limits and then balancing it out is just as important. And in the modern world, we see that, specifically in New York City, a culture based on constant stimulation, the whole time, constant stimulation. And then, because stimulation means consumption, and consumption means a good consumer. It means, the more people consume, the more you can sell them stuff to consume. So restraint is unfortunately not going to be pushed by any company. This is very bad for business, unless they can sell you something that helps you restrain. But unfortunately, the problem with restraint is that, I guess there's a few industries that try to help people like learn discipline or learn restraint. And I guess the wellness industry, to a certain extent, tries to maybe push some courses and workshops where you try to help people restrain. But over the whole, the corporate world is much more interested in pushing consumption. Yes, ma'am.
So what you were just talking about the simulation,
Yeah,
resonates a lot as someone who's very much a victim of the consuming media and stimulation. And what I realized is that for me and for a lot of other people, you just imagine that consuming and being stimulated, that's like what you do, that's what's enjoyable, and not doing that, like, oh no, I can't even think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Now I just thought of how every time I do consume all this media, I don't feel good after, and I actually feel worse. And so now I'm starting to realize, like, I'm actually better off, like, not doing any of this. And that realization, like, almost instantly now, I'm like able to like read books and stuff. Just because I didn't believe that, and then I saw it in reality, and I thought, why am I even doing any of this?
That is really cool, because that what you said leads me exactly to the verse I want to read tonight. You'll see it ties in quite nicely. So at the end of the Bhagavad Gita, there's this description of something that's very a sort of a concept that comes up again and again. It's the idea of the three modes. That in the world, there's like these three different modes of being. Just like there's three primary colors. So you have, red, blue, and yellow. Is that correct? Or red, green, and yellow? Something like that.
Red, white, black.
Red, white, and black. I never heard that one before. But I think depends. I think there's also different colors. I know you have primary colors for painting, and then you have primary colors for light, which is not actually always the same. But we all know three primary colors. And those are like the three basic colors, but then you can mix them. And then you can make all kinds of different, you can make an infinite variety of colors. But at the end, it's really just those three ingredients. So to explain that the whole material world, and now we're not speaking just about colors that you see, we're speaking about the foundational ingredients for matter. Like these three kind of ingredients, three gunas or three qualities, which is goodness, the mode of goodness, the mode of passion, and the mode of ignorance. And this in itself is a huge topic and very fascinating to study. And then you can start, it's like these goggles that you put on and you can see them everywhere. It's like the code. You can see the code of the matrix running and you're like just looking around, you're like, wow. So these modes are very interesting because they're outside of us, but they're also inside of us. And like everything you do, if you eat something, you can like see, like what is this going to push me towards? So goodness, we know what means peace. Mode of peace, tranquility, what we call foresight, the mode that you can look and you can have an accurate idea of like, you can see things clearly, a mode of clarity. Then the mode of passion, which is what we were speaking about mostly. Action, pushing, striving, strong desire. And then ignorance, which is also something we know, which is just dark. Depression, anxiety, darkness, violence, aggression, which as you can see, it's something very different. It's like this different thing where people do stuff that it doesn't bring them happiness, it doesn't bring someone else happiness, but it's there, it's real, we can see it every single day. We see examples of it in the news where someone is overwhelmed by ignorance and like that dark aspect of human nature, and they can just do the most horrible things that also just brings horrible results to themselves, which is the weirdest thing about ignorance, that it just doesn't bring happiness for anyone, but it's very much a reality in this world. So these three modes, they're everywhere, and even happiness can be experienced in each of these three modes, can give you a specific kind of happiness. There's happiness in each of these three modes. So in the mode of passion, it says that happiness, which is derived from contact of the senses with their objects, as we said, consuming stuff, it's like sensual and stimulating, which appears like nectar at first, but is poison at the end. That is said to be happiness in the mode of passion. Okay, so that's happiness in the mode of passion. Nectar in the beginning, but poison at the end. You know? Classic example, say you get really drunk. It's like super fun, woo! And then next day, you get the poison. Yeah? And then you feel it, and you're like, God, that actually what I drank last night, it poisoned me. And you're vomiting, and you like feel like crap. So mode of passion, 100%. Nectar in the beginning, poison at the end. Same thing, you live a super heavy lifestyle, boom, 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 you're working hard, go, 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 boom, your health just totally fails. You get like really sick, your immune system is all shut down, like you have no energy, and they have to carry you out of New York with a stretcher. You have to go somewhere in Pennsylvania to just go sit there for a year or two so you can recover. So we see New York City runs on that energy, right? It lures all these young people in, and with nice big paychecks, and then the young people just have to work like super hard for a few years, and some of them make it. You can make it, and then you become like middle management, upper management, and a lot of people just can't make it. They just crash and burn, and then at some point they're like, they just go leave New York City, and like, wow, that was a rough ride. So mode of passion, mode of ignorance. Well, let's first start with mode of goodness. The mode of goodness, which is, what do you expect is the mode of goodness? It is poison in the beginning, but nectar at the end. It is that happiness which in the beginning may be just like poison, but at the end is just like nectar, and which awakens one to self-realization, is said to be happiness in the mode of goodness. Yes?
Which verse is that? Because I want to read that.
This is the 18th chapter, verse 37. 1837. So mode of goodness then is based first on restraint, which is poison. Discipline is It's like, it sucks. Let's be honest. I mean, you can glorify it, and you have all these people who sometimes like make their cool YouTube videos about how wonderful it is, but discipline is unpleasant. 100%. There's no going around it. It's like restraining yourself is not a pleasant experience. It's not natural. We don't like to do it. But if you do it, there is nectar at the end. There comes some nectar at the end, and that nectar comes in various forms. So restraint, poison in the beginning, nectar at the end. And as we speak about rasa and restraint, a big part of happiness, a huge part of sustainable happiness, is the ability to be restrained. If there's no restraint, your happiness will last only as long as your body has some energy in it. But the energy in the body is almost like a sponge that can have some water. And if you enjoy, it's like you squeeze it. And if you keep squeezing and you keep squeezing and you just keep squeezing, at some point it just becomes dry. And you can see that. You can see people use like hardcore drugs for a long period of time. You see what happens. The body just dries up. The eyes become shrunken, and like the skin sometimes also become all taut, and like they lose a lot of weight. They just squeeze, like the energy is in the body, and they just squeeze it all out. So happiness in the mode of goodness is then turning that tables around. And then happiness in the mode of ignorance, it is just like poison in the beginning and at the end. It's just total darkness, which is the weirdest thing. And even when they speak, in the Sanskrit itself, they have this thing where they speak about the modes, and they say, this is this mode, this is this mode, and then they use this word tu, which means but. And the commentators say, but this mode is like, this is such a weird thing. This is the weirdest thing ever. Ignorance, such a strange thing. Like, even though we are all looking for happiness, but then somehow when you get infected by the mode of ignorance, you just do things that cause you suffering and other people suffering, and then you're left scratching your head. Why do people do this? And it's one of those things that are very difficult to understand in this world, but at its root is anger. The anger that comes with becoming frustrated in your attempts at enjoyment. Frustration that builds up over time it short circuits the brain, and you can't really see clearly what brings you happiness in other people. And that thing builds up and builds up. And to be honest, if you look at some of the worst examples of that, if you look at school shooters, for example, which is such an example of that, which is this, why do you do something like that? You kill all these kids in the school, and then you're going to go to prison for such a long time. It's like, why does someone do that? But then if you look, all those kids, none of those kids were like prom queen or like, the quarterback or something. It's people that are deeply frustrated, deep frustration and unhappiness that then builds up over a long period of time, and then somehow it pops up in that way. And that is the mode of ignorance. Very, very dark. And definitely something, even though most of us don't descend into that kind of darkness, but we all have our periods, isn't it? We all have our periods of darkness where like depression hits us, or like, we can really feel it feels like there's no happiness in life, and things can get very weird if we're in that dark space. We all have our moments of darkness. So a culture of restraint then, in the Vedic culture, we see that it's amazing how this principle of restraint is built into the fabric of society. And it's like something that is encouraged, something that is valued, and something that is taught also at a young age. So we see that there's, in the social steps of Vedic society or spiritual society, the culture where the Bhagavad Gita comes from, the first stage is brahmachari life. And the brahmachari is now, like we speak about a monk, and the core theme of being a monk is, as we know, is being celibate. But that's not really what brahmachari means. It means just being restrained. It means for a period of life, when you're a kid especially, you learn restraint. So we see in Greek culture, it's very interesting, or in Roman culture, they spoke about, especially the higher classes, especially those who would become maybe the emperor, or even those who, like the children of the established ruling class, they would speak about their kids getting a Greek education. And that meant is that the kids, would one day become princes and Caesars, whatever, they would sleep on the floor. They would just wear these woolen clothes that are very uncomfortable. So the idea is that you have to, for a few years, they have to live with very little sensual stimulation, and they have to be very restrained, so that one day when they become the king, or when they become senators, or when they have all this power and opulence, that they will not be bewildered by it, that they will not be pulled by it and misuse it and abuse it in the ways that we see people can do. So similar element is there in the Vedic, in the Bhagavad Gita conception of society, is that brahmacharya, restraint, restrain yourself, learn how to keep it in, so that when the time comes when the energy has to go out, you're not destroyed by that outward movement. We see in yoga, for example, for those who are aware of the 8 steps of yoga, what's the first 2 steps of yoga? Is the yama and the niyama, which basically means restraints and regulations. And then there's also the principle of what you call pratyahar. Who knows pratyahar? Pratyahar? Pratyahar means the ability to pull the senses in. So the senses naturally always going out, and out. And for us, most of the time now, a lot of it has to do with the phone. Like your phone is like the visual and the audio-visual senses are like, there's never a time in history when we have seen and heard as much as we do now. There's like no doubt about it. Our brains are not at all designed to deal with that amount of stimulation. So the audio-visual senses, it pulls out. So pratyahar is that ability to pull in. And I don't know if any of you have had that. We all have our various addictions. For me, even though I never was into it, somehow in the last few years I got into the news. Like I never read the news, like the news. My dad read the news. Who cares about the news? But somehow, and I guess it's once I started paying taxes, I started to become a little more aware. I started thinking a little bit. Hey, what's exactly where does this money go? And so then you start reading the news and you're like checking it out. But now it's like, geez, even just one day without the news, it's like very difficult, because I want to know what's happening in the world. And you have your little news sources and you go on there. So these are all things that we have to learn to manage. So pratyahar is that ability that we sometimes have to do and the classic example of that is fasting. Now, I don't know about you, fasting is something I find extremely uncomfortable, but at least I know that it's very powerful. Like to go a day without eating, for example. I remember before I got into the practice of Krishna consciousness, I had never in my life probably even skipped a meal. What to speak about like not eat for a day, like voluntarily not eat. That was like not in my house, In my house, we ate, It's like when you're hungry, you eat. And my mom, even my wife, her mom, she says always growing up, she would always used to tell them, whenever I ask her in the house if there's something, I say, hey, can I eat this? And she would say, food is for eating. It's like, you gotta eat. Like that's, life is about, if it's there, you gotta eat it. So, but then I got exposed to a culture of fasting, which is amazing. It's like very difficult, but if you do it, it has this huge resetting effect on your system, especially as you get older. As a kid, it's not good when you're young and you're growing, but when your body stops growing, you sometimes fast, and again, you have to see what's good for your body type, but it is that experience of it's poisonous in the beginning, but at the end, it can clean your body so much, can give you so much energy, can reset your system, make your digestion stronger. So this is all stuff that was built into the culture. It used to be part of Western culture as well, general culture as well, but it's sort of phased out. We don't really do that anymore because it's so much connected with religion. So all the religions have some time that you have to fast. And but as religion has sort of slipped away, people are like, why the hell would I fast? But you see, fasting is really powerful. Another thing which is very interesting is for those of us who heard of the Kama Sutras, for example. So the Kama Sutra, what is the Kama Sutra? Who knows that term?
Book by sage Vatsyayana.
And what is explained in the Kama Sutra?
Sex, marriage.
So the Kama Sutra is famous because it's the book that deals with sex, like how to have great sex, and they have all kinds of sex positions in there, and it's very interesting, and people find it fascinating. And if you go to your bookstore, you'll find tons of translations of the Kama Sutra, and it grips the mind because what can we say? We're an over-sexed society, and we're fascinated by it. But if you actually read the Kama Sutra, as I said, it's actually written by a sage, and the idea is that it's about telling people how to enjoy in such a way that you can at least find some level of satisfaction so that you can think about something else, so that you can satisfy the desires, just like eating. There's like, if you haven't eaten properly the whole day, you'll be thinking about food. And if you ever go to the office or to work, if you're used to eating breakfast and you have to go to work without eating breakfast, you're going to be sitting there and the whole time you'll be thinking about your bagel, like you missed it. And then you become more angry. So the idea is that if you can satisfy desire, then you can bring some satisfaction in life, and then you have the ability to think of something else. So, but a large part of the Kama Sutra is actually on understanding how sensitive the ability to enjoy is with the material body. The material body is to enjoy is actually very difficult. It's like you have to really be careful with how you handle this thing. You can fry it out very easily, you can overstimulate it very easily, and even with pleasure, you can very easily become satiated with something. Like where the same thing that gives you pleasure can now give you disgust. So therefore, a lot of the Kama Sutra is actually dealing with restraint. You have to handle these things in a very restrained way, whether it's having sex or eating or all these kind of things, because then you can have sustainable pleasure. And it's not just something that burns up and you have some passionate love affair and then 2 weeks later you totally hate the person, you never want to, and you're just disgusted at the mention of their name, isn't it? So sustainable happiness and sustainable pleasure, it's very difficult, and it has to be combined with a certain sense of restraint with whatever it is that we are doing. So same with food, as I said. If you're just stuffing your face the whole time, the satisfaction you get from food decreases very quickly. You know? And then if you start just emotional eating, where you're not eating because you're actually hungry, you're eating for some other emotional reason, then it gets very complicated. Because now there's no, it gets all confused. So restraint then we see is something that's built in all these ancient cultures. And it is important for material success, as I said. So even for happiness within this world, and even for being able to sustainably apply ourselves to fulfilling our goals within this life, in our business, wherever, we have to learn this ability. We have to somehow make it part of our culture, of our own personal culture, where we have to find some time to shut off. You cannot always be plugged in. You cannot always be just eating, consuming, watching, just thinking the whole time. You have to build in things in your own personal culture where you pull back, where you restrain. And that is also very important where spiritual life comes in, because a large part of our spiritual practices, they only work if you are able to pull some energy from the world. Like generally as the world pulls our energy out, you have to pull some of that energy back, and then you have some energy that you can then invest in your spiritual life. Like meditation, if you have ever if you ever experienced meditation, if you if you go out partying the night before, you do Lord of the Rings marathon, you watch all 3 movies in like one day, then the next morning, if you try and do your meditation, it's going to be tough because your mind is just so tired and like so full of stuff. And then whatever meditation you do, you're going to be so confused and distracted, your concentration is ruined. So restraint then preserves some energy for us, and a big part of spiritual life is in taking our energy from the material world, from the temporary realm, pulling it in, and then engaging it in spiritual practices like kirtan, hearing spiritual philosophy, doing meditation. We have to have some juice, we have to have some energy to also put into these practices, and then from them we'll get so much more fulfillment. So there's a lot to say about building these things into our general life. I mean, now for each of us, now you have to get into the details of your life. How am I going to do it? And then we can start swapping tips. What do you do? Like I try to sometimes cut the news. I also sometimes try to cut out sugar for a few days. Like I can't live without it because then life would just be, what's the real point? Life without sugar, I don't know if it's really worth living. But sometimes I've seen, it's very interesting how sugar, if you eat a lot of sugar regularly, for me it becomes very difficult to avoid my phone, because the sugar gives like energy to the mind, to the thoughts. A big part of monastic life, when you get into just the kind of tips you learn when you live in an ashram, is that you have to stay away from the sugar. And the reason I was growing up, when I was in the ashram, we only ate sugar once a week. Because if you're going to eat sugar every day, you're not going to make it. Your mind, it's going to be the discipline of the ashram will become too restraining. But if you avoid the sugar and you just eat it sparingly, then the disciplines become much easier. So, and same thing when it comes to something like fasting, not just fasting from eating, but also the senses. Just you have to somehow at some point give yourself a break and pull it in and just pull your energy in a little bit, whether it's one day a week, or 1 day a month, or, we do it when we go on holiday, but how often times you can't just once a year for a week go and switch off, and then the rest of your year you're just always switched on. So how exactly you build it in, that's all up to me. I'm not here to tell you exactly how you're going to do it, but more the principle of seeing the value of restraint, both for sustainable material happiness and also as a basis upon which we can pursue our spiritual life. And seeing that unfortunately our culture is not encouraging it, like overtly. So, but when we get exposed to the spiritual culture of the Bhagavad Gita, we'll see that it's built in there. There's great appreciation for sometimes just pulling in, keeping things under control, and also making that a part of our regular life. And that is something that can really give us great, as we said, it can be poison in the beginning, but it can definitely be nectar at the end. And starting to differentiate between these different kinds of happiness that we have, and that's part of our life. It's really something that's been of value to me, and something that I'm at the moment struggling with. As I'm saying at the beginning of my talk, I'm not sitting here as some highly restrained person, but as a total addict. I'm totally addicted to intensity, and therefore I'm thinking about this also regularly as I'm also trying to fight and trying to keep things a little, trying to keep restraint a part of my life and not just get totally carried away by the waves of this world, which carry us very much outward and stops us from going inward. So those are a few thoughts. I went a little bit over time. I apologize for that. But we can see if there are any questions or any comments. Yes, sir.
So restraining also is kind of like intense.
Yeah.
So it's like tug of war, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how do you even, like what is not intense? Restraining is intense.
Yeah.
Intense is intense. You know?
Yeah.
Like how do you even
Build it in. I think when it comes to restraint, I think we do it with a lot of intensity. It doesn't have to be so intense. I think it's exactly there where you have to learn, like if you're switching off, you have to do it in a way that doesn't have to be the super challenging. Now it's like again, like, okay, fasting is good. Never fasting is good. Okay, next week, no eating for 7 days. I'm just gonna fast or just drink water for 7 days. It's like, hey, calm down, buddy. Calm down. It doesn't have to be so intense. So I think if we start looking at our own life, how can we build in a little bit downtime, pulling back? We don't have to do it with that same level of push. Start small. Start small, because that's the whole point. Is you want to temper this intensity in a way that doesn't have to. You don't have to use this extreme willpower and determination. You don't have to push yourself to the limits of your ability to restrain yourself. That's the whole point, And for me, it was really like for example, in the beginning when I got into fasting, I was like really into this thing of like, because my monk leader, he used to fast like twice a week or twice a month. He would take no water, no food, and he would just meditate for 8 hours a day. And I was like, this is it. That's the real deal, I want to do this. But I just can't, fasting is so difficult for me. I can't do it. If I don't drink water, I conk out, I faint or whatever. This doesn't work for me. So then at some point as I got older, I was like, listen, just take it easy. Like now if I fast, what I do is I just fast in the middle of the day. I just fast until lunch and just maybe eat some fruit, eat some milk. And that has been helping me so much more if I want to have a day where I shut down and do my spiritual practice. It doesn't have to be this grueling, intense thing. So I think when we approach restraint, it's a very good point. I think it's exactly that we don't have to approach it with that same level of push. And taking the edge off is actually going to help us, especially if you know that you yourself are someone who's always pushing. Try it out a bit. Like in Ayurveda, for example, they say the Ayurvedic principle of exercise, as they call it, the principle is Ballard, which means only 50% of your maximum capacity. You should never push yourself beyond 50%. Now, when I was younger, I was really into exercise, and then I got into Ayurveda, and I was like, 50%? Like, what's the point, man? It's like, you're not going to get the burn, So, but if you try it out, it's amazing. If you would actually do it for a bit, and if you do weights or whatever, and you just do 50%, and because the goal is not to grow or to push, the goal is actually health. It's an amazing experience where you have to now actually pull yourself back and be like, hey, let me not push myself to the limit. Let's not train to failure. Let me just do 50%. And do it for a while, a little bit, to preserve myself. So yeah, very good point. Be careful with taking that intensity into our restraint and then again making it the same kind of principle. So the idea is exactly that, to temper it out. Thank you. That's a very nice question. Any other comments? Yes, ma'am.
What strategy strategy would you suggest to get into the restraining mode? Because it is so difficult. So
Yeah.
how do you prepare yourself psychologically, or what do you tell yourself in order to...
100%. I think that there are, in terms of when we look at our own culture, our own personal culture that we build, there's things we try to do every day, and there's things we try to maybe do every week, and then there's things we maybe try to do every month, and then maybe things we try to do once a year. So, like in spiritual life, for example, we have meditation, which is something we try to do every day. But then we have a pilgrimage, which is something once a year. You maybe go on a pilgrimage, and then like, okay, now for a whole week, I'm just going to go to India, and I'm just going to do this one thing. And so I think we have to look at these small things, little bigger things, and maybe big things. It's obviously always easiest to start with a small thing. So I think for me, there's this crucial part of the day, which is the time when you wake up between the time you eat breakfast. And that little window is this little golden window that you have every day. And how you use that time is very important. So I think by starting with that, for me, I have a rule. Like obviously, I think the worst thing you can do, and again, depends on your work and your occupation, but trying to keep that little window, make it as big as it can be, maybe half an hour, maybe an hour, because you have to start waking up a little earlier to have a nice time in the morning where you haven't eaten yet, you haven't started your day, and then see what you can do with that. Reading scripture, doing some meditation, that's exactly the kind of thing that doesn't have to be too difficult, but it brings in this other energy where you're not ready, you're not going to start opening your phone and looking at your meetings or the news or whatever. So even if it's just a little window period every day and you use that consistently, you see it can really build up, and you build some momentum with having a little time of the day where before you get into the day and all the things you have to do and your daily things. That's maybe a good place to start. And then, as I said, building out at some point, maybe once a month, you can take a day off and spend the whole day where you're just not on your phone. You're not on your phone today. You maybe eat a little lighter, and you invest in things that are, invest in spiritual things that take your consciousness elsewhere. So I think the looking at these various opportunities we have, there's always a little something, and don't be afraid to start very small. Even if you just start with 5 or 10 minutes in the morning, even that is such a great beginning, and you can build from that and make it bigger, and then turn it into a real solid practice of internal cultivation. Any other questions or comments? Anyone here? Nityananda.
So 2020, I decided, okay, January 2020, I was going to be one meal a day for a month. And it was kind of like, it was like a quick build up from intermittent fasting for just like a little bit for like a week to like 1 meal a month.
Yeah.
1 meal a day.
One meal a month.
1 meal a month. 1 meal a day.
That's a good program.
No, it felt like 1 meal a month.
That's his kind of program. He'd like that program.
It was very, very hard for me. It was really, really intense, and I only planned to do it for that 1 month, but I felt so much better. My sleep was better, like asthma, everything was so much better. So after the month, I was like, oh, I'm just gonna stick with this, and so basically since 2020, I haven't had a meal before noon.
Wow.
And then sometimes meals in the evening, but what I found out that is if you do something that is like poison, like hell, for I would say about 45 days, that just becomes normal, and you just realize, okay, this is you can be able to distinguish what is the chaotic ramblings of the mind and what your body actually needs. Mm-hmm. And like for me, my body, like I have more kapha, pitta. Those people can fast. Vata, yeah. I think you're vata. Vata people just like they all like they start falling apart when they fast too much.
Yeah, yeah.
But my point is that after about 45 days, some people say 20 days. I was like, about 45 days, that new trial and tribulation that you've gone through, that new thing becomes normal.
Yeah, no, and that's a very important point, is that when you say poison in the beginning, nectar at the end. It doesn't. At some point, it becomes just like you become used to it, and it becomes very good. It's like the nectar, because like that's the point. When you start experiencing the benefits, then it becomes so much easier. And yeah, also appreciate the point of understanding. With a lot of this stuff, it's very individual. Very like we all have. Like when you start trying to tweak your own personal culture, it really has to be individual. Because, like I said, for some people fasting works great. For other people, it doesn't work at all. But the principle holds for the same for everyone. But we have to find something that really works. And yeah, like Nityananda said, you might even be surprised. You might do something. It's like getting up early. You know, like it's very difficult in the beginning, but at some point you're like, wow, this is just, you know, if you really start doing it and you start adjust to it and your body clock adjusts, it's like, wow, it really is an amazing experience to have, and it becomes your new normal. And that's one of the most amazing things about being a human, is that you can actually change. You can change your personal culture. You can change what's normal for you, and that's a big part of growth in life. Is that you have a certain level at which you're functioning, but if you put your energy into, you can really change. Like, you know, you can come to a new kind of normal that's just normal for you, and that's a big part of spiritual growth. Also, is that we see these changes, we have these positive experiences, and that just becomes who we are. And at some point, it's just so much part of your life that, you know, this is how I live. And that's a big part of building character, is exactly that, where what starts as a little practice or a discipline, at some point it becomes part of who you are. And all of us here, we have so much of that already. Like, just, you know, so much of these things that we sometimes take for granted. You know, like being honest, for example, not stealing, all these kind of things. Like, some of this stuff, you have to appreciate how much we already have good stuff we have to work with. You know, a lot of things already we have in place, and let's continue that momentum and move forward. So I think if we can end here.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be with you all, and I look forward to being here at some point again.